So this session is being delivered by my lovely friend Mark, and it is to some extent, I think, a reprise of a talk that he gave at COP26, which is really representing how normal consumers see sustainability, and therefore if we want to communicate sustainability, we might need to message it more smartly. Is that fair? Something like that.
Yes.
Over to you, Mark. Tell us
Yes,
what you really meant.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you for having me at Holocon. I'm delighted to be here and thrilled and really impressed with what you're doing with this event. It's really fabulous to see, and I'm honored to be asked to come and speak on this. So just a quick personal introduction. I've been doing digital stuff for a very long time, since 1993, which is shortly after that when I first met Neil. And we sold our company to Razorfish and became part of that for 3 years. And then I stepped out together with a couple of colleagues and formed Fjord, a design agency. Fjord grew very happily, and we sold the company to Accenture in 2013. We're now, I think, probably the largest design organization of our kind in the world. We've got about 2,000 designers in 36 studios. I stepped out of leading Fjord about 2.5 years ago, and I now lead innovation and thought leadership at Accenture Interactive. And as part of that, what's landed on my plate very happily, because I went looking for it, is sustainable customer, brand, and experience. And I'm going to talk about, as Neil forecast, I'm going to show you what we did at COP26. Let me just make sure that I'm sharing the right screen, and we will go from there. Okay, so I'm going to go full screen. Are we good? Can we see full screen?
All good.
Great. So there are a lot of sustainability vectors, and I'm not going to try and sell you, what we're doing at Accenture, but let me just give you a little insight into that, insofar as we've defined 6 main vectors. So those are things like carbon zero and how companies are driving towards that, their sustainable organization, green IT, sustainable supply chain, and ESG reporting. And these are all major themes which a lot of clients are now taking very, very seriously. But there is a 6th one, which is at the end of all of those things, at the end of a sustainable supply chain, somebody is opening and using a product or experience. At the end of a metric, there is a human being. In fact, if we're going to shift to carbon zero, there's a human being doing something different everywhere. There's a human everywhere. And what we wanted to do in Glasgow was to bring the voices of ordinary people into the hall to talk about their experiences, local Glaswegians, because sustainability is both a global but a profoundly local issue. We experience sustainable issues, environmental change at a local level. And I came up with this idea, I think, back in March last year, and began to push at it. A couple of things became clear quite quickly. One was that for security reasons, the security conversation lasted about a nanosecond, getting ordinary punters off the street and getting them to come and talk in the hall about what they experienced, which was disappointing. What was not so clear to me, but became clear afterwards, was actually we were the only organization that had this idea, which surprised me because I was terrified that other people would all be doing the same thing. So I think that also tells us something quite interesting, that not very many people thought of doing this. We then really expanded on it. We didn't just pull people in. We went and did the research with Glaswegians, and we did a major ethnographic study over about 8 weeks during the summer, and we videoed that study. And what I'm going to show you now is the results of that study, together with some videos which I think are beautiful, but also bring to light a lot of the themes that we discovered. And I'm going to start by just grounding us in, I want you to imagine you're in Glasgow, it's COP26, and we're just reminding people is where we are.
More than 40,000 years ago, men or women splayed their fingers thus and put their hands to bare rock. They chewed ochre, red ochre, gritted charcoal and blue with projectile effort that really took it out of them, their living breath. Raw gouts of pigment spattered the living stencil that was each's own living hand and made their mark. We do not know why they did it, and maybe they did not either, but they knew they must. It was the cold cave wall, and they knew they were up against it. We might have moved on from primitive paintings and cave walls, but we're still up against it. It's too much to expect the lone person, gripping their trolley with the weight of the world on their shoulders, to make all the right decisions. The impact of each good choice is ill-defined, the cognitive load is too heavy, and the cost of not trying is too huge. Corporations have the power to make the intangible tangible. To lighten that load, it's their responsibility. It's their turn.
I always think it's good to start with poetry, and that was Liz Lochhead, who's pretty much Scotland's national poet. Also, the music was by Mogwai, who are a Glasgow band. So here's our start point. The sustainable consumer. Where are they? The problem we've got is that sustainability has been viewed, I think, historically over the last 20 years by a lot of ordinary people and by a lot of organizations as somebody else's job. Why? Well, organizations have been waiting for customers to say, we want sustainable products, we're going to pay extra for them, bring them to us now. It hasn't happened at anything like the volume we might want. Consumers expect organizations to be better, do better, offer better. So we're kind of waiting for this perfect world where everybody, I'm laughing here because I know Neil and Ben so well, but this is not a dig at you. Somebody else wrote this, I assure you. Where everybody drives Teslas, drinks oat milk, holidays just down the road from where they live, eats plant-based burgers and offsets their flights on a regular basis. It's not happening. It's just not happening. So we have these, what I call pull versus push dynamic going on. The pull dynamic is the degree to which customers are saying, give us sustainability, we're going to preference sustainable organizations. The push dynamic are the other forces which are working organizations, and I would single out 5 critical ones, all of which we've seen in the headlines over the last year. So there is government. Love him or loathe him, Boris has mandated it's got to be electric vehicles from 2030 onwards for new sales. That is a government push which has redefined and shaped what the industry will do. Then you have the courts. Shell got hauled over the coals in Holland for not meeting EU-wide standards for what they should be trying to do. Then you have shareholders, Chevron and Exxon, pretty much that same week as Shell were hauled over the coals, brought down to earth by a shareholder revolt, very widely reported. Then you have employees, Amazon shareholders going on strike, not you might have thought about paying conditions, but because they want the company to take sustainability much more seriously. And lastly, and for me, maybe the most powerful, you have the children of CEOs. Anecdotally, I have met several CEOs who said to me, my children are nagging me and saying, it's the equivalent of that First World War poster in Britain, what did you do in the war, Daddy? Or in fact, what did you do in the war, Mummy? And indeed, I was talking about this with our head of sustainability overall at Accenture the other day, and he lit up and said, we actually have done this research, and it's true. That I can't remember the exact number, but way over 50% of CEOs report they are feeling strong family pressure to go in this direction. So here we have this problem. The forces that are pushing organizations here are probably, in our view, working much faster and harder than consumers are shifting to demanding sustainability. So what that means is that we actually have to break the stalemate. And this is the first major point I'm going to make of 4. The stalemate is based around this gap, the gap between what people say and what they do. Already, I would imagine there are some of you going, whoa, hold on a moment. You know, I know lots of people and I've read lots of reports that say because customers will preference sustainable products. That is true. There are lots of reports that say so. The highest in the world of concern around sustainability is actually Mexico at 94%. Even the lowest in Egypt is 50%. But we have this gap where the majority is saying, yeah, I want purpose from the things I buy. But the reality is only just over a quarter actually shift their spending as a result of that. So you might look at this and say, well, okay, so organizations, if you've got this mismatch in forces and organizations are going to be pushed into taking sustainable products and services to market, then surely it's down to organizations to find a way to close the gap. But it's not actually as simple as that. I started this project thinking, well, this is all about behavior change. But even there, what our research showed was that behavior change has a lot more nuances. We actually need to rethink what we mean by the say-do gap and the simplistic conclusion, which I started with, of, oh, this is all about behavior change. Say is part of the problem. Say is a nice to have for most. And, you know, we've seen this with opinion polls again and again with politics, where people say one thing, but in the privacy of the voting booth, they actually do something completely different. So say is easy to do, but when it comes to do, it goes way down the priority list. So what we're looking at here is quite probably an aspiration do gap. But actually, our view, pessimistically, is it's even more a vaguely back of mind do gap for many people. It's impossible to talk about this now without referencing what's happening in Eastern Europe. Because my belief, we've no research to back this up yet because it's too early, because of course, you know, that war has only just broken out. But this is actually going to get worse, particularly when you look at the inflationary pressures, which are definitely now heading our way. Around both fuel and the pass-on costs from fuel to almost all products, wheat, many. So this has probably become an even more urgent challenge. So we decided to look at life at an everyday level. And what I'm going to show you first of all is a video which shows the lives of our. I think it's important if we're looking at, you know, real people. Let's understand the warp and woof of their lives, the fabric.
It's quite like a small industry in Glasgow. Everyone sort of knows everyone, so it's quite easy to get a job in coffee once you've got one.
See you later. Have a good day.
I think we were just at the pub one night and then we just saw each other about all the time and became pals and then ended up being colleagues.
Yeah, it's just Glasgow. It's the drinking man's Las Vegas. Everybody just meets in the pub. We get a big mix. Because we're quite vegan friendly, the majority of the people that come in are vegan. They are conscious of the environment. I mean, we just had like one of the best summers we've ever had. And if that's not climate change, I don't know what it is. It was like sunny for like 2 months.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen.
Well, keep the monkey. Big Marty. Like it?
Mind me asking what year you were born?
Who, me?
Yeah.
1941. The day they struck the Bismarck. 29th to the 5th, 41.
Pity he wasn't on it sometimes.
Jimmy, what's your hopes for the future?
Get his fish supper on Sunday.
What's your hopes?
And what do you want for dinner? Come here. Do you want In my household, there is a Yule which is 5 months old. I've got a 5-year-old and my husband. Can you sit down for 1 second? There is not enough time in the day to get things done. It's hard, especially with 2 kids. You feel like you're constantly chasing your tail. You tend to kind of like bypass things quite a lot.
Go. He's a having ease. which is the national dog of Cuba. I looked at a Bolognese as well, which is from Bologna, but they were just really, they're about that size. I mean, I'm bad enough being this size, taking him out for a walk. Yeah, so in July, I had a bit of a health scare. I took a heart attack in the living room after letting the dog out, giving him his breakfast, and it was all right to all wrong. It was as quick as that. You could have clicked your fingers. I'm the kind of guy you would find quickly checking emails when they're on the holiday, that type of thing. That whole side of things to me that's now stopped.
I just graduated uni this May, and then since then I've been working in hospitality ever since. Most of my money goes on rent, and then food, and then probably going out. You know, maybe I spend money on clothes. I buy like loads of like stuff like online, second-hand. Probably where a lot of it goes as well.
I left school with no real kind of intentions of doing anything, and it was my dad's past that encouraged me to want to work on cars. Emily, my oldest daughter, was born. I was 19 years old, so still very young myself, very naive. And Sophia came along 2 years later when I was 21. This year's been tough for everyone, coming out of lockdown and stuff like that. I've also had my own hurdles along the way. The passing of my dad earlier on throughout the year, do you know what I mean? So I would say my plate is pretty full, you know, because obviously I've got work commitments. I've got my new house, I've got my 2 children, I've got a child on the way, you know. When people are shocked to see that you're a parent at that age, they're brilliant wee girls though, they keep you going, and I couldn't ask for better children.
I showed my niece these films the night before I gave the speech, and she lives in Glasgow, and she said, "You just landed on your feet, didn't you? Because they're just natural performers in Glasgow." And it's true. I think they bring really to life this Hannah and Mark, Jimmy and Linda, and Nabila here, Stephen, Blair, Sean. They all had one binding sentiment. Life's tough, and we're doing our absolute best with it. And it's been particularly difficult during COVID. We've got no capacity, no time, no resources to do any better. So we don't believe customers are going to break the stalemate. In fact, looked at like that, the mass market sustainable consumer is almost certainly a myth, because the gap, the say-do gap, is wider than we initially hypothesized or even hoped for. It's not just about making sustainability more affordable and convenient. To think about it like that is a mistake. Basic decisions are tied to our priorities for ourselves, the individual, our priorities for the others we live with. Think about, you know, Sean and Nabila, and this is critical, how we want to be perceived. In fact, identity and our sense of identity is absolutely critical to this. Let's have a look at the next video, which really gets into some depth about the trade-offs and compromises around identity that people are thinking about when they think about sustainability.
People would say I'm daft for cars. It's all I've kind of really known and had an interest in. I've had this car for 5 or 6 years. It's more of a kind of labour of love. It's a donkey, it'll just keep going. You put diesel in it and it runs. My car, which obviously doesn't meet up-to-date Euro emissions standards, but I can't really afford an electric car. I couldn't work in Govan, which is 11 miles from here, and then have to rely on public transport or cycle, you know, when the weather's the way it is in Scotland. My children are the hardest thing because they are so fussy. They like chicken nuggets, they like mince and potatoes, do you know what I mean? So to then come home and try and cook 4 meals for 4 different pallets is not sustainable when you're burning all the gas and you've got all the lights lit, you know?
I think like we can all take like a bit of personal responsibility for it, but there's only so much that me recycling is going to do. You know, I'm vegetarian, trying to make steps towards vegan, because like dairy and meat agriculture is one of the biggest polluters, but that's like personal things, and I'm able to do that. Not everyone in the world is able to do that.
Too salty? No, I didn't. The word sustainability didn't really mean much to me, I would say, until quite recently. I remember kind of watching the David Attenborough Planet series on Netflix, and I think that's when it really kind of started to hit home. I think when your child points it out to you, you do think about it a lot more. And then when he comes home and he knows more than you, you definitely want to Google that and find out what's happening. My shopping habits, due to COVID and things like that, have changed so much. And I've just become used to getting things online now, and they just get delivered, and it's just so much more easier.
This is when we do the lining anyway.
I'd love to, at some point, go vegan. I'm not right now.
Well, I eat meat, so I'm a terrible example.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just so tasty. It's almost like they try and price people out of the market. So it's like, to make yourself feel good, you go like, oh, I'll get a wee vegan thing.
Will I go from cutting out meat and going to some other maybe plant derivative or a vegetarian derivative? I don't really see that happening.
You're filthy.
Certain things you just don't want to get away from. There's nothing better than having a steak on a Thursday night. I suppose you've got to put the right kind of fuel in, and if anything from what we've discussed and what's happened to me in the last few months, that's important. You walk into Aldi or Morrison's or wherever you might be, and you go to that bit in the fridge where it says, here's your steaks. You don't have the plant-based derivative or the vegetarian derivative next to it, because they're off in another section that I would tend to probably not look at. You maybe look at things and try to buy loose stuff, but then 2 hours later you're on ordering stuff online, and then it comes just covered in packaging. You've then been driven by convenience, and the whole bit of doing your bit for save the planet is went out the window.
So let's reflect a bit on what we've just seen. Firstly, I find it fascinating. There's quite a lot of terminology in there, which is more at the expert level, or heading towards the expert level than you might expect. So they talk about EU emission standards. Sean does. Mark talks about plant-based derivatives. The second thing which jumps out is where is it at odds with their identity? His whole life is wrapped up in cars. His dad just died and he remembers his dad because his dad taught him all about cars. Then it becomes much, much harder. But we know that we need to move in this direction, if nothing else, well, for two reasons. A, because the five forces are pushing companies there, and secondly, because we know it's the right thing to do. We have a climate emergency. So what do? It's needed. We need to do behavior change, but how do we go about it? We need to reframe it. Our client organizations already do behavior change. The behavior change they do is about getting people to preference their brand rather than somebody else's at a very macro level, or to try their brand and then stick with it. We need to eliminate this line between what's good for the environment and what's good for your family, because total behavior change is not actually realistic. Humans don't work like that. We've got to look for incremental change, and that means initially at least 3 golden rules for brands. The first is you don't need to lead with sustainability. In fact, it may even be counterproductive to do so. For the majority, for Sean, for Nabila, for Stephen, it doesn't need to be explicit. In fact, if you over push on the sustainability line, it may lead to feelings of shame, guilt, annoyance. That's not actually going to help you, any organization with its sales, and it's certainly not going to help move the whole cause forward. So you have to lead with what matters most to people, and then add sustainability as a co-benefit. So we're not saying bury it, we're saying you may not want to lead with it. The second point is, if sustainability requires sacrifice, it's going to be really difficult. I'll tell you a personal story on this. I had to go and I didn't have to. I went to speak at a conference back in September, first one I've done actually for almost 2 years, live in Hamburg. And I took the decision that I wanted to get there by train rather than aeroplane for obvious carbon emission reasons. And I took a very detailed diary of all the things, all the factors that shifted because I went by train rather than plane. In a nutshell, German railways don't work nearly as well as the propaganda says that they do, I can assure you. And it took me 15 hours. Hamburg turns out to be peculiarly difficult to get to from London by train. And it took me 15 hours station to station, as opposed to 1.5 airport to airport. Now, the emissions I emitted were way lower, but finding out what those emissions were, I'll tell you more about that in a moment. The point was, I've got to go to Hamburg again, actually, this week. Very reluctantly, I've taken the decision I just can't sacrifice 15 hours there and 15 hours back, as opposed to the flight. So I'm taking a flight. I don't feel good about it. But in this case, sacrifice of work time, of cost, because it actually costs more to do this because you have to spend 2 nights in a hotel. If it takes more effort, more price, if it means buying food you think the kids might not like and then having to throw it away, it's not going to happen. The third is that sustainability is effectively the new form of purpose and needs to be integrated into everything you do. I'm hearing now the rise of what I call triple native startups. Really interesting insofar as they're digitally native, so that it's just second nature to them to use all the digital tools which a lot of larger organizations have been grappling over the last few years. The second thing is that they are purpose native. They've actually built the organization ground up from an understanding of what can we do which is purposeful. That's their primary question. And third is they're sustainability native. They're doing everything around the green agenda. Those triple native companies, I think, represent a really interesting both learning point for larger organizations and indeed in the same way as digitally native organizations have proved to be a massive challenge to incumbents, so they will prove over time to be a massive challenge to them. And this is the new, I think governments have a role to push road safety, vaccinations, healthy eating. We've seen this over the last few decades. I don't think we can rely on governments to do that anymore. This is where I think, again, the 5 forces mean that organizations need to step forward and make this absolutely integral to what they do. So if they're going to do that, then how do we help people, this is one question, fulfill their desire to make sustainable choices? But there's a problem with that statement, which is it's likely a minority or niche game because it's seeking to close the say-do gap. But we need to close the very back of mind do gap. So this second question enables sustainability as a more mass market outcome rather than pointing us to a minority. And that leads us to our 4th major statement. So we've talked about how we need to break the stalemate, why it's important, incumbent on companies to do that the mass market sustainable consumer right now is a myth, that we need to reframe behavior change. The 4th major point I want to make is this is all actually about reducing the burden of choice and making it easy for people to go there. And this is, of course, a huge mission for organizations to take on. I don't think we should pretend that what we're talking about here is anything other than a significant shift in the role of organizations in the lives of society, because what they need to do is lead the way. It's not about making sustainability alternative. It's about how do you make it possible for the everyday person. And there are 3 keys to this, which I'm going to dive into at least at a relatively high level. The first is to think about how do you influence people? These are all, by the way, of course, things which organizations, particularly through their marketing, are well used to doing. And then what you offer. And lastly, how do you engage overall with society? So let's look at each one of these. If we go and look at it's all very well saying influence, offer, engage, but this is all about the things you control. Influence is all about the key marketing and communication skills you have. Offer is the core of what you put out there, and engage is who and how you lead. There's a lot of talk in sustainability about, and there should be, about information. But the risk here is that we see this as basically being an abstract issue. It's not about increasing people's abstract understanding of a complex issue. I think that level of education is at worst doomed to failure. At best, you're going to have a hard challenge. When I did that trip to Hamburg, one of the bits of research I did was to go and look and see, where can I find information about the carbon impact of traveling by train as opposed to traveling by plane? It was not easy to find. Eventually, unsurprisingly, most plane companies do not advertise the carbon impact at the point of purchase of what you're about to do. Although I'm happy to say, I traveled just a couple of weeks ago on Virgin Atlantic, and they have started doing so. So kudos to them for doing so. And Trainline are beginning to do it as well for train trips as well. But I found a website called Eco Passenger. It's a wonderful website. It allows you to look at the carbon impacts of the travel that you're making, but it actually presents almost too much detail. And that detail, if we're not careful, is something that people aren't going to want to roll around in. So we need to think about, how do we present information in a way which intuitively helps people grasp in what Daniel Kahneman in his book Fast and Slow Thinking would call the system one part of their brain. How can we make it really easy? And what you're looking at here is experimentation being done by Foundation Earth on labeling, which makes it easy for people at the point of purchase to do exactly that. So the question is here, if you think about Daniel Kahneman's System 1, System 2, and the reluctance people have to dive into System 2 thinking because it's plain hard work and most people don't want to go there, how do we make it intuitive for people to make the right choice? The second question then is, how do we provide clarity? So what does good mean? We don't want people to have to be climate scientists. This was the challenge with Eco Passenger. We need to make it easy for people to understand the information we're presenting. So it's not just intuitive, but also there's great clarity on what they get. That clarity needs to extend right the way through. I have a BMW i3, which I got about 3.5 years ago. The challenge I've got is I live in a very rural area. In order to minimize the weight, they've created a special kind of alloy wheel for the i3. And guess what? It buckles when it comes up against potholes again and again and again. I've actually spent something close to £2,000 on new wheels. I know, over the last, I can see somebody reeling back, over the last 2 years, over the last 3 years. Now, of course, lots of things radiate out from this. One of them is there's nobody to complain to. I've tried the dealer, they're not interested. I've tried BMW, they're not interested. They say go talk to the dealer. Well, what also, the last time this happened, I went in with the wheels to get them changed. And I said to the dealer something I hadn't asked before, which is, what happens to the wheels? He said, oh, they go in landfill. I said, you're kidding? He said, no, we have 2 lorries a week that come and pick up tires and wheels and take them away to landfill. So I feel like when I bought that car, I did not get clarity and I did not see the full impact of what I was getting into. So the question here is, and I believe that it is the auto manufacturer's job to have thought that through for me and tell me what I'm getting, not to leave it to me to find out. The third point then is context. So context is critical because context is the sort of what's the point question. If it's just me sitting in my house in Sussex, but the whole world is doing something different and, you know, there's war going on in Ukraine, etc., how can I make any difference? What's my contribution? My carbon impact on that flight, on that train journey to Germany, turned out to be 31 kilos of carbon emitted, as opposed to 130 if I had taken EasyJet. That's good. I quite like that, but that's it. I don't know what to relate that to. How does that relate to what Neil does? How does that relate to my next door neighbours? So we need to find a way to help triangulate And there are some really interesting companies out there doing this, like Duconomy, who are a really world-class startup in Sweden, who are working with MasterCard to help show people what the carbon impact of their purchases are, and gives them, I love this, a carbon limit every year, like you would have a credit limit on an ordinary credit card, and cuts you off when you reach your carbon limit. So how do we make it easy for people to really triangulate that information and understand the impact of what they do? One of the things that we heard from our users in the consumers we talked to in Glasgow, one of them said, if Stacey Solomon, for those of you like me who didn't know who Stacey Solomon is, she's a C or B list celebrity. If Stacey Solomon was talking about this over social media, I would pay attention. So this is not just about the triangulation. It's not just a technocratic job. It's also about presenting it to people through voices and media which they understand and which are proximate to them as well. So then we can also shift what we offer. And I think, this is certainly about innovation. My view is that we're entering an era where we need to and will actively think about the redesign of absolutely everything. That we will literally look at everything around us, and younger people will especially do this, and ask questions and say, has this been made in the right way? That fundamental question is going to be at the back of our minds increasingly over the next few years as climate change worsens. So innovation then is going to be covering its role, and in fact the role of sustainability and innovation become completely intermingled. It's impossible, and I lead an innovation group, it's impossible now, I think, to lead innovation with any conscience in any organization without sustainability being built into it. And of course, vice versa, sustainability requires innovation. And we're doing a lot of work to systematize the way in which sustainability is built into the innovation questions we ask. The second thing is about providing value. So what we mean by value is don't compromise on the things that matter to the customer. Nike have been world class at doing this. They're creating much more sustainable running kit, but they're not compromising on the performance for the athlete, because they take that just as seriously. My own favorite is a company called Karun Eyewear. So Karun Eyewear, actually, it was meeting the CEO there that really got me thinking about the triple native thing, because he absolutely embodies that. They're based in Chile, and they literally go around picking up ropes and other bits of debris on the shores of lakes and on the shores of Patagonia, the seas of Patagonia, and they then turn it into eyewear. They've just won a contract with Grand Vision right the way across Europe to supply eyewear, but they are not compromising on beauty, because the reality is nobody's going to put an ugly pair of spectacles on their face, no matter how wonderfully purposeful the organization is. You actually need to make sure that beauty is in there as well. So sacrifice is not, at least for now, the route we can sustainably go down. And then lastly, you need to think about the motivation of customers. I talked about that earlier. We do things for ourselves. We sometimes do things in a selfless way. We sometimes do things for social comparison as well. And our research showed the kind of very rich tapestry around this, that you need to understand what it is that is motivating customers in order to be able to pull off this trick of building sustainability in as a co-benefit. The last thing that companies do is they engage, and I'm going to highlight 3 things to do here. This is an all-company thing, and it requires organizational change and a completely different mentality, which is why one of the major themes that we're pushing at and building a team around is sustainable organization and the shifts that are required culturally and mechanically in organization to make that happen. So we need to get under the skin of customers, particularly, and I think this is a massive challenge right now. The world is in a sorry state. Not just because of the climate crisis, but of course because of COVID, and now because of what's happening in Ukraine. As somebody who spends a lot of time researching and understanding what people are thinking and feeling, we need to watch this understanding this at considerable depth, the kind of contextual depth that I'm talking about today and beyond, becomes a matter of real urgency. The second, of course, is collaboration. Experiences cross industry boundaries, and we can't afford to look at things as sustainability as a PR contest with our direct competitors. I think many organizations are getting beyond that. Customers don't see industry like we do. They think about, how do I heat my home? How do I keep my family warm? They don't think energy industry. They think about, how do I provide nutritious, or indeed any food, to my family and my children? They don't think about the food industry. So we need to create collaboration, not just between different firms, but across industries, and view that in the way that ordinary people view their lives, rather than viewing it through the industry clusters. And we're seeing some good signs of this. For example, the kind of metrics that Foundation Earth are doing, where they've got Co-op, M&S and Sainsbury's beginning to work together. If you look at Pulpex, that's a venture for packaging design between Pepsi, Unilever and Diageo. Who would have thought that they would, be collaborators? Or the information that I was talking about earlier between Duconomy and MasterCard. And then lastly, we need to lead. So this is about engaging proactively and creating legislative pressure. We need organizations to step forward and put pressure on governments to create the systemic changes. And I think that the 2030 announcement by the UK government is a good example of this, and help shape the debate. So IKEA, Sky, Uber, Volvo, maybe you don't know this, not many people do, but they've been putting pressure on the EU to end internal combustion engine sales by 2035 as a collective group who span way beyond just the automotive industry and into a lot of different areas. So in summary, we can't rely on consumers to say, we get it, we don't like forest fires, we can see all of this, we're going to shift our behavior now. We can't rely on a belief set that sustainable products are going mass market anytime soon, because identity matters to people, and behavior change, although I still believe it's the mission certainly that I'm undertaking with my team, behavior change matters a lot. We've got to think about it in a very subtle and nuanced way. And the key to this is to reduce the burden on the ordinary consumer. So I'm just going to show one more video, which shows what our respondents said in Glasgow when we asked them about what role they thought companies should take.
You put in a lot of effort to be like sustainable, to be like carbon neutral, and it's just, everybody does it, but I feel like it doesn't make any difference, because there's still going to be like, I don't know, tyre incineration factories or whatever.
I don't think the companies do care as much as they maybe should.
Big business is often forced to make changes rather than getting on the front foot.
I think they should be putting more into it. They're selling this stuff, so they should be putting more into the environment, especially the ones that are making the plastic crap stuff, you know what I mean?
To be more sustainable, we're being guilt-tripped into spending more and more money on sustainable products.
I think we've all got a part to play in it, and I do definitely think that companies that are delivering do also have a part to play in it.
The waste that I produce in my life is minuscule in comparison to, and I think I do make sustainable choices. Like, I do use reusable products, but I'm still like a tiny, tiny amount in comparison to these corporations.
I would like to know that all of my electricity comes from renewables. I want to know that my heating comes from renewables. I want to know that my house is properly made so that I'm not letting out energy that I don't need.
I would take them, the CEOs of the companies, get them all together and take them on a wee expedition.
It'd be nice just to see some, as I would say, stepping up and really leading with, this is why we're doing stuff.
Take them to the coral reefs. I would do that. I'd go right round the whole of the British Isle. I think somebody's already doing that.
Aye. Big supermarket chains, they're not short of a few pence, do you know what I mean? But obviously the corporate machine is obviously just going to keep turning, and they're going to become hungry for more and more money. That's what businesses do. Businesses generate money.
Corporations are going to be the ones who possibly make our world uninhabitable.
Instead of putting an advert on the telly, put something about what's happening with the climate and how we can help. Just advertise it. There's no advertisement anywhere. They'll not know. My dad doesn't know a lot.
I know you about that.
He doesn't know about anything.
You?
Money and greed is not what makes the world go round, you know. I think it maybe boils down to that. The world needs a change. Not for me, but for my children and for their children and their children's children.
It's amazing what people say when you listen.
Mark, love that. Thank you so much. As a leadership consultancy who don't really sort of confront sustainability yet, what do you think that we can or should be doing?
I think the critical thing is to embed sustainability questions in everything that you do. I just, you know, all the science is saying we may even be beyond the tipping point. There is nothing more important. And so I cannot see a reason why we would not embed sustainability questions in almost every single meeting and every single event. I'm not, there are of course other things in life. I mean, this is what the research, I believe, shows, that there are other things that matter to people in life. There are other things that matter to CEOs in life as well. Of course there are. So we can't lead with it and dominate with it unless you're working in a very specialist group like I am, where it is our job and our role to push at it. But I do believe it just needs to be built into everything that we do as we coach and talk to leaders and try and understand the challenges they have.
We do actually have the question in one of our team diagnostics, and the answers are very disappointing. But we haven't done enough with those answers yet.
I do believe that when I've talked to quite a lot of senior people about this, and I do believe that confronted with that 5 forces argument, they realise the truth of it, and they realise they have got to do something about it. And we're certainly seeing a massive increase in demand from our clients to understand what they can do and how they can go about it. I think the other thing is it's very metrics driven at the moment. So pretty much all CFOs now understand that they need to work to get the metrics that show how sustainable their business is and what they're doing around carbon zero in particular. Most of it focuses on carbon zero rather than nature regeneration, although personally I believe logically it's slightly less important than carbon zero, but it is going up the agenda very fast. I think I think curbing emissions and circularity are then the 2 big areas where we're seeing probably the biggest focus. But I think rather than just think about the numbers, it's finding a way to connect the impact of what you do with the numbers that your CFO is now beginning to worry about quite a lot, because the whole company is being measured on it. So think of a triangle where you've got at the top you've got the sustainability measurements of the company as a whole, and there's lots of interesting organizations out there like Arabesque S-Ray who are busy creating those numbers. You can really find the numbers surprisingly easily. Then there's a level below that in the triangle of what's the individual product impact, whether the product is a flight or a shoe or a car. And then at the bottom level, the widest impact of all, of course, the individual, what are consumers doing and how do their numbers ladder up to the bigger picture. So I think, you might need, I guess what I'm saying is you might need a framework to be able to talk about this with leaders, which helps them begin to focus on the things that matter to them and begin to help them to think about where the soft points are they can create change. I think what I'm seeing is, rather than just making noise about sustainability, which of course I think is an important thing to do, it's giving people a framework. And that's what, in that speech, we're attempting to do in the last 20 minutes or so, is to say, here's a framework for thinking about this and the places where you can take action.
It's interesting that participants in Holocon are about 50-50 client side and practitioner side or consultant side. Everyone here is a consultant. And I think that's interesting. But I think also actually this particular group, we could come together and actually sort of turn create more of an offering than we've got. And I think your framework might be really useful in that. So thank you.
There is a climate assessment that we know of as well for corporations. It's run by an organization called TRIOS, which not only looks at that individual organization and the impact of its products and services, but also the ecosystem of contractors and subcontractors who supply within that value chain as well, which is a critical part of the dimension of achieving sustainability. It's not just something that an individual company can do. It's something that the whole ecosystem involved in its value chain has to address.
Well, so AstraZeneca have asked us to fill in a nightmarishly complicated environmental impact assessment form as a supplier.
Right.
Yeah, which is and because it's not written for organizations like us, it's written for much bigger organizations. So yeah.
Actually, although it's a nightmare for you, it's actually a good sign that they are doing that. It may also be a sign that they are starting, like I said, with a CFO-led concern that they need to know their numbers, and they need to be able to publish those numbers. And I know we all know, the old adage about, what gets measured gets done. But I worry a little at the moment that it's all about measurement and not enough about, innovation and sustainable innovation.
And taking decisions.
Yeah.
Uncomfortable ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, a number of our clients talk about sustainability. So AstraZeneca does, and Specsavers do. Q8, ironically, have probably done more than any of the others. But it's so they do talk about it, but whether they're, the extent of real action, I think, is still quite limited.
But for quite a long time, Q8 were quite a pariah within their own ecosystem. So as a subsidiary company of KPC, they were seen as being rather naughty children for going outside the boundaries of what they were supposed to do. Yeah. And it was only because they had a Maverick MD that they managed to achieve what they have done, which is admirable. But of course, he keeps getting slapped down.
Well, and the Dutch government helped as well.
Maverick MD thing is really interesting because there's a few of them out there. There's obviously Paul Polman, at Unilever, who I think he divides opinion, but a lot of people lionize him for what he's done, and he has created real change there, and that is being continued by Alan Joop right now. But there's also the guy whose name I'm afraid I forget at Danone, who came in and tried to do something similar to what Paul Polman was doing at Unilever. Yeah. And the business results were not good, and he didn't go about it. From what I hear from people who understand what happened, he went about it in a way which enraged the shareholders and couldn't keep control over the board as a result, and then got dumped. And certainly, one of the stories that went around then was our clients are going to stop. Some of our clients were backing off worrying about sustainability so much because they saw what happened to him. But the real story of what happened to him is a bit more nuanced than that. There were other political things going on. But this naughty CEO narrative is quite an interesting one. It does seem to take quite brave people. What Pullman did was he managed to get everything aligned with the business results for Unilever, and the business results for Unilever were great under his leadership. So he managed to keep that going. That didn't happen at Danone, but there may have been other reasons at Danone for the lack of business results apart from the emphasis on sustainability.
Yeah, they just got blamed for it. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Ben has a question. Mark, how do you feel about green tax as one of several ways of nudging consumers towards more sustainable choices and companies towards more accessible, sustainable choice?
Well, I think they're inevitable. I think they're absolutely inevitable. I mean, I think, although I can't see how we can get there, I think flight rationing would be a really good idea. You just give people a number of air miles they can have every year, and then they can choose what they do with them. But of course, the political problems with that is that would just savage the airlines. So no one's going to do that in the near future. The other thing about green taxes is I don't think you're going to see significant green taxes for at least the next couple of years, while inflation is rampant. So I think it creates a very, very, what Putin has done in Ukraine has, ramifications way, way beyond the terrible suffering of Ukrainians. And it's really seriously damaging and will damage sustainability, I believe.
Except that to some extent it is a green tax, isn't it? Because it's pushing up the cost of fuels and transport.
It's true. And I think people are making logical jumps. Like the Germans are beginning to realize that, everyone is beginning to realize they need to look for alternative sources of energy, including nuclear, which controversially, personally, I'm a fan of. But we need to look and take seriously, getting those alternative sources of energy. So maybe we'll look back at it and say that what he did galvanized the world to a greener and more sustainable place. I think in terms of green taxes from a consumer level, that's going to be a very, very hard trick to pull off. And when you look at, our old friend, well, there may be people who feel differently about him than I do, but I doubt it on this call. Our old friend Nigel Farage, he is now busy running around the home counties, organizing an anti-carbon zero movement. So he's done Europe, now he's going to do carbon zero. That's his ambition. I don't think he'll succeed, but he's tapping into exactly the same elderly, stupid population who fell for the EU lies, and he's now going to do it with carbon. Sorry, I'm getting off on my high horse. But it's but make no mistake, although I don't think he will have anything other than a marginal effect, now is a fantastic time for him to be doing that from his perspective.
Yeah, maybe. Some green taxes could be cost neutral. That's the other thing. They don't have to increase the cost of living.
In what way?
Well, you could I don't know, raise the price of fuels, but subsidize other alternatives.
Yes, that's true. And I think those subsidies for other alternatives, those may have to kick in and hard, particularly if the conflict with Russia, the economic conflict with Russia goes on for any considerable period of time.
Insulate houses. That's
exactly
the big thing. Pay for that. Very good. Okay. I don't think there's a mingle now, because I think we're at the.
There isn't. There's a big long break.
We're at the lunch break. So, has anyone got any final thoughts or questions before we let Mark go?
I'm delighted to see Rima on here. I haven't seen Rima for ages, and I didn't know she was part of your group. That's fantastic. Hi, Rima.
Hi, Mark. Great presentation.
Thank you. Lovely to see you again.
Great to see you.
We were hiding.
Hiding, multitasking.
Very
But
good to
this
see you.
got my attention, and I really appreciated how much you were listening to people. I think we have a lot, all businesses have a lot to learn there, and should be a core function of leadership to enable that thinking. And I guess this is what this is all about.
Yes, I'd echo that. Thank you, Mark. I was very gratified to hear a couple of things in that, and really pleased to hear that the data is backing up a lot of my own suspicions. I remember having a rather impassioned argument with one of my deranged relatives-in-law about what will save the world. And he was adamant that it would just be technology, that new technologies would swoop in and save us all, and we wouldn't have to make any changes at all. I was at the time talking about behavior, but I'm really pleased to hear that it goes even further back into the state of being, our rationale, our thinking systems, the way that we approach the world, and how the people who are shaping this market and the future for the rest of us are also paying attention to that. I think that's absolutely the right way to go. Thank you for that data.
If you look at the Bill Gates book that came out, I think, last year, which is very good, it's very, very Bill Gates, because he's looking at largely what I would call technocratic solutions. He doesn't think at all or very hard about what ordinary people will do.
No.
And I think, you know, that he's only looking at 50% of the picture.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for having us, having me.
Thank you, Mark.
Neil.
That was wonderful. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for contributing, and we'll see you
Pleasure.
next time.